All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're gonna spice things up a bit. We're talking oysters,
Sounds delicious.
but we're not just, slurping down the delicious kind. We're
No.
gonna pair them with some international trade and economics. That whole how the world works stuff.
Interesting combination.
Right. So our main course today is this article about Bryan Salliga, who owns Fishtown Seafood in Philadelphia. And he's dealing with the fallout of U.S. tariffs on, get this, Canadian seafood.
Canadian seafood. Really? Now that's something you don't hear every day.
Yeah. Imagine, you're running this seafood business, right? Everything's going great, customers are happy, and then boom, tariffs hit.
Ouch. Yeah, that's got to be tough.
Salliga's trying to keep his business going with these tariffs that keep, going on and off again. It's got to be so stressful. I mean, I would think businesses would just, raise prices, but it's got to be more complicated than that, right?
Oh, way more complicated. It's not just a simple price hike. You're talking about disrupting an entire market when you throw tariffs into the mix.
Right.
Businesses like Salliga's that, rely heavily on imports, they've got to make some tough choices.
For sure. Do they just meet the cost? Do they raise prices? Do they, scramble to find new suppliers? And all while trying to, maintain the quality that their customers expect.
It's a juggling act, that's for sure.
And the article mentioned something crazy, 60 to 70% of his oysters come from Canada. Why so much reliance on one country? What makes Canadian oysters so special?
Well, for one, Canada has this, massive coastline, perfect for, oyster farming.
Yeah.
So they've got this really consistent supply of high-quality oysters.
Okay, that makes sense.
But it's not just the supply, right? Salliga talks about how his customers, they love those Canadian oysters, specifically the size, the taste, the whole brand.
Oh, so there's a demand for them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's a real demand. And that makes this whole tariff thing even more complicated.
Okay, so what happens when you slap a tariff on something everyone loves? Salliga mentions having to limit his selection and maybe raise prices, like we talked about. Can you help break this down? How do tariffs actually hit the consumer's wallet? Is it just an extra tax or something?
Yeah, you got it. A tariff is basically a tax on imports.
Yeah.
But it's the ripple effect that's really interesting.
Okay, so the ripple effect.
Yeah, the importer, someone like Salliga, gets hit with this extra cost, and they have to figure out, do they absorb it, which cuts into their profit, obviously, or do they pass it along to the consumer?
Right, and I'm guessing it usually ends up being a little bit of both.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
So the cost of my oyster platter goes up, but what are the unintended consequences? The things people don't think about right away.
Ah, that's where things get really fascinating. Think about it. If Salliga has to cut back on those Canadian oysters, well, those Canadian farmers, they lose business, right? Consumers have fewer choices. And this whole oyster market, which, by the way, was booming.
Yeah, I was going to say, oysters were getting pretty popular.
Exactly. So the whole market could, take a hit.
So these tariffs could actually be their downfall. Or is it just a temporary setback? What do you think about the long-term impact on this, the oyster market?
Well, anytime you disrupt a supply chain and you create uncertainty, businesses get hesitant.
You understand?
They don't want to invest. They don't want to grow, especially in a market like oysters, which was on the upswing. Add to that potential price increases for consumers. Yeah, that momentum could definitely stall out.
It's like a domino effect, right? One policy change and then all these other consequences start happening. And here's something that I found interesting. Salliga's worried that even if the tariffs go away, prices might stay high. He calls it a value realization. Can you unpack that? Why would prices stay high even after the tariffs are gone?
That's a great question. It really shows you how complex this whole market dynamic is. You see, when prices go up because of something like a tariff, it can create a new baseline.
Oh, interesting.
Suppliers might realize, hey, we can actually keep these prices higher, especially if the demand stays strong.
So some producers might actually come out ahead while others, and of course, us, the consumers, end up paying more. It's easy to get lost in the numbers and stuff, but we got to remember there are real people behind all this.
Absolutely.
Salliga's just trying to make a living, pay his employees, and keep his customers happy. What advice would you give someone like him? Someone trying to navigate all of this crazy economic stuff.
Well, in a volatile market like this one, agility is key.
Agility.
Yeah, being able to adapt.
Yeah.
And Salliga is already doing this. He's tweaking his inventory, working with his clients to make menus that aren't so sensitive to these, tariff fluctuations.
Yeah.
It's about being proactive, strategic, and, thinking ahead.
Yeah, that's smart.
Building strong relationships with suppliers and exploring, alternative sources can also help create a buffer against these unpredictable trade policies.
That makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like staying informed, being adaptable, and thinking long-term are, crucial in this kind of situation.
Absolutely. And it's also recognizing that something that might seem like a distant policy can have a real impact, often immediately, on everyone involved.
It really makes you realize that Saliga's story is just one small piece of a much bigger puzzle. This isn't just about oysters, is it?
Not at all. This is about the whole intricate web of global trade. It's about choices governments make and how those choices have a ripple effect, impacting industries worldwide. It's about those big choices, yeah.
And those impacts can be huge. I mean, the article mentions that the U.S. imported something like $25.5 billion worth of seafood in 2023 alone.
Wow. That's a pretty massive number. It shows you how much the U.S. relies on seafood imports, just to keep up with the demand.
Yeah, and Canada's a big part of that, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. They're the biggest supplier to the U.S.
Yeah.
They send over $3.6 billion worth of seafood in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
And get this, that number actually jumped up to almost $4 billion the following year.
So even with these trade tensions, it seems like the U.S. can't get enough of that Canadian seafood.
Well, it's a good reminder that economics often, defies simple explanations.
Mm-hmm.
There's this interplay of factors like consumer preferences, supply chain logistics, and then, of course, government policies.
And speaking of government policies, the article really focuses on the Trump administration's tariffs, but this isn't just a U.S.-Canada thing, right?
Oh, no, not at all. Trade wars and tariffs, they're happening all over the globe.
So it's kind of like a global food fight.
Yeah, you could say that. Trade disputes, they're just a constant in international relations. Countries often use tariffs to protect their own industries, or to kind of gain leverage in negotiations.
But as we've seen with Saliga and his oysters, those tariffs can, totally backfire. They can end up hurting the very people they're supposed to help.
Yeah, that's the danger, right? Tariffs can disrupt these, really complex supply chains. They raise prices for consumers.
Yeah.
And they can even spark retaliatory tariffs from other countries. And then it just escalates the whole situation.
So where does this leave us? The people who actually buy and eat these oysters. What can we do when it feels like these massive economic forces are, totally beyond our control?
I know what you mean. It can feel like we're just along for the ride. But I think there are things consumers can do. For starters, just staying informed about trade policies and their potential impact is huge.
So we need to do our own deep dives, huh?
Exactly. Understanding where our food comes from and the factors that, influence its price can empower us to make better choices.
And maybe even speak up and advocate for policies that support fair and sustainable trade practices.
Absolutely. Our choices as consumers, they send a powerful message to businesses and policymakers. They kind of tell a story about what we value and what kind of future we want to create.
It's like those oysters traveling all the way from Canada to Philadelphia, right? Our decisions are all part of a larger ecosystem. But let's shift gears for a second and go back to Saliga's story. He's facing some tough choices in this unpredictable market, isn't he?
He really is. And his experience shows the human cost of these economic battles.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to get lost in these abstract discussions of trade and tariffs, but at the end of the day, there are real people and real livelihoods at stake.
Yeah, the article mentioned he's considering scaling back his oyster selection, offering a smaller range of both higher-end and more affordable options. You think that's a smart move?
It's definitely strategic. By offering, a diverse price range, he's trying to appeal to a wider customer base, making sure he doesn't alienate those who are, more budget conscious.
Makes sense.
But it also means that he might have to say goodbye to some of his most prized and probably most expensive Canadian oysters.
It's a trade-off for sure. He's adapting and making tough decisions to keep his business going. He also mentioned that switching entirely to U.S.-sourced oysters isn't really an option. Why is that?
Well, domestic oyster production is already stretched pretty thin. It takes several years for oysters to grow, so farmers would have needed to anticipate this years ago to be in a position to capitalize on it.
It's a reminder that these supply chains, they're not built overnight, right? They're intricate systems that rely on long-term planning and stability. Disruptions like these tariffs can really throw everything off. What about this idea of value realization that Saliga mentioned? He seems to think that even if these tariffs are eventually lifted, some prices might never come back down.
That's a really interesting point. And it suggests that this whole situation could lead to a permanent shift in the oyster market. Some suppliers might use this as a chance to, establish a new higher price point.
Which could be good for some producers, but could hurt others who can't compete at those higher prices. And of course, it could impact consumers who just end up paying more for their oysters.
It's a complex situation with no easy answers. But by understanding the, different dynamics at play, we can at least make more informed choices and navigate this turbulent economic landscape with a little more awareness.
I like that. It's about being informed, being adaptable, and recognizing that our choices as consumers have power. Speaking of choices, the article focused on oysters, but I can't help but wonder what other everyday products are being affected by these tariffs and trade wars.
That's a great question. Think about it. The clothes you wear, the electronics you use, the car you drive. So many of these products are part of global supply chains that can be impacted by trade policies.
So the next time I'm shopping for a new phone, maybe I should stop and think about the journey that phone took to get to me and all the economic forces that shaped that journey.
Exactly. And maybe we can even use that awareness to make choices that align with our values, like supporting businesses that prioritize fair trade practices and sustainable production.
Okay, so we've talked about the impact of tariffs on the oyster market, the broader implications for global trade, and the power of making informed choices as consumers. But before we wrap up, there's one more thing I want to touch on.
Okay, I'm listening. What's on your mind?
Well, Saliga mentioned that he gets some of his U.S. oysters, directly from fish farms. Is that like a growing trend in the seafood industry? Are we seeing like a farm-to-table movement, but for seafood?
It's definitely gaining some traction. There's a lot of interest these days in sustainable aquaculture, which is basically just farming seafood, but in a way that, minimizes environmental impact.
Right.
And consumers are getting more aware of, where their seafood comes from and how it's raised. And that's definitely driving the demand for, locally sourced, sustainably farmed options.
So it's like you can have your oysters and eat them too.
Right.
Good for the environment and good for the consumer who wants, that high-quality, ethical seafood. Could this shift towards sustainable aquaculture, help create more resilient supply chains, making businesses less vulnerable to those, import disruptions we talked about?
It's definitely possible. By, diversifying those supply chains and being less reliant on imports, businesses could create a buffer against, the volatility of global trade. And as the demand for sustainable seafood grows, we might even see a shift towards, more localized production, which could have some really interesting impacts on the industry.
It's kind of wild how this whole tariff thing might actually be a good thing in the end, it could encourage the growth of more sustainable and localized food systems. So if our listeners are craving some oysters, what's the takeaway? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be informed and curious. Ask questions about where your seafood comes from. Consider, supporting those local and sustainable options when you can. And remember that your choices, they have a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Every decision we make as consumers sends a signal to the market.
So we're shaping the future with every bite.
Exactly. Our actions as consumers, as businesses and policymakers, it's all connected, We're all part of this really complex and ever-evolving system.
So the next time you're enjoying those delicious oysters, remember, they're more than just a tasty treat. They represent, global trade, sustainable practices, and all those forces that shape our world.
And maybe they'll even spark a conversation about responsible consumption and the power of informed choices, right?
That's a great point. Let's all raise a metaphorical oyster to knowledge, awareness, and the power of making informed choices. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.